Now, open your Bible to the book of Genesis. I'll be there in a few moments. I left off, the last time I was teaching on was Joseph Imhotep. And there's many, many messages now, probably several dozen. I know there's going to be more being put up on the web site either this week or next week. If you want to get caught up, that's for your information. Tonight we're going to look at the flawed Hyksos theory. Some believe, in the religious circles, that Jacob and his clan of 70 plus people, when they migrated to Egypt at Joseph's request and invitation, was part of the shepherd kings that would eventually come to rule for a temporary time in Egypt. And there's different variations of the Hyksos theories concerning that. First of all, I don't believe Jacob or Israel are the Hyksos. I don't believe that one bit. By no means I believe that. They were never identified as that in scriptures. And in secular history, unless you stretch your theory out far enough, and you're not going to find that. So it's just an assumption and a guess. I don't live on assumptions and guesses. I live on things that I can prove using God's word and secular history. That's the way I research things out. Now, furthermore, let me see if this is working tonight. Maybe I can get a map on here and show you and then come in here real quick and get this thing going. So I could use it. Because there's a map on this writing pad I want to use. And if I can't get it going, I don't want to waste my time on it. I want to show you, and this is the reason why some have assumed that the Hyksos, where they originally dwelled in a certain area of the Middle East, could be the tribes of Israel that eventually migrated down to Egypt and ruled there for a while. Not so. Put on the map when you're ready. The Hyksos, as far as we can tell with the present evidence that we have, in 2016, originated in this area. Let me do this in red. Originated in this area right here. Northern Syria, southern West Turkey. Now, some believe they also migrated down the two rivers in present-day Iraq all the way down to Babylon. Or at the very least, they dwelled in northern Iraq as we know it today in the map. But then eventually they migrated down this way. I believe when they migrated south into southern Syria, Israel, and Jordan today, Lebanon area, and even parts of North southwest Saudi Arabia. They migrated there because something left this area, and that something was Israel. Israel. Why? Because Israel migrated to Egypt at the invitation of Joseph, and they dwelled in the area of Goshen, the Nile Delta. That's where they migrated because of the famine. And when that happened, when the famine was over, eventually, over several centuries, the Hyksos, which was called the Big H here, migrated this way, migrated that way, and also migrated south towards northern Saudi Arabia today. But eventually, there would be kings, foreign kings, and that's the Hyksos, that originally started up here, stayed there, but also migrated south, southwest, south, and southeast from their originating point, point A. Now these foreign kings came into existence, into Egypt. I believe the Egyptians, the pharaohs that lived not alongside, separate, and there's a reason why, which I'll get to in a minute, but lived peacefully with the Hebrews that came into Egypt for decades after decades. They were able to have peace between them, but there was a time when kings or pharaohs would not know Joseph and respect and honor what he did for that nation. And what better candidate or candidates for that attitude to overwhelm this area of Egypt than foreign invader kings, the Hyksos. I believe the Hebrews went into slavery and bondage when foreign Hyksos kings came in and started to rule in Egypt. So this whole area became Hyksos influenced and ruled and was governed by the Hyksos. Now, with that, you could leave it on there for, oh, come back to me. I'll tell you when to put it back on there. Now this is where I'll start reading. Traditionalists uniformly accept that if Joseph existed at all, then he likely lived in Egypt during what is called the Hyksos period. That's traditionalist opinions. Just prior to New Kingdom's 18th dynasty. You can put it back on the map. One problem with that. We said the timeline was wrong. Joseph lived somewhere between the 3rd, you can put it back on the map, and 4th dynasty. That's when Joseph governed Egypt, between the 3rd and 4th dynasty. Not when the Hyksos came in between the 16th through the 18th dynasty, depending who you want to believe in their traditional viewpoints. Not the 16th, 17th, or 18th dynasty. Joseph was in Egypt during the 3rd and 4th dynasty. Not the 16th, 17th, or 18th dynasties. That's when the Hyksos came in and ruled Egypt. Foreign invader kings that knew not Joseph And that's very important to understand and make clear. These are foreign kings. It never did make sense to me that kings in Egypt, the way they honored Imhotep, another name for Joseph in Egypt, centuries and centuries later, that they would attack the Hebrews, knowing Joseph's one of the Hebrews, and dishonor everything that he did for that nation of Egyptians. Religious, governance, political. Joseph influenced everything about Egypt for many, many decades. I don't care if it was just 100 or 200 years. Egyptians don't have a short memory. Egyptian pharaohs and kings didn't have a short memory. They tried to preserve their history. And they were not eliminating Joseph, who was Imhotep, from their history. They were not eliminating Joseph, which also is Pathotep, from their history. But some kings came in at some point after Joseph's death, and not soon after his death, but at a period after his death, and started their own dynasty, forgetting what Joseph, not forgetting, trying to eliminate what Joseph did, and govern and rule according to their way of how they wanted things to be operating in Egypt at the time. Foreign invaders came in. These Hyksos knew not Joseph. Why would they? They were coming in from this area as they migrated southeast, occupying the land, and then eventually moving to the Sinai Peninsula and then into Egypt, because there was no governing force in the area that Jacob left. Nothing to hold them back. No king himself to stop their progress. Why? Because they were all here, being taken care of by Joseph as long as he lived. And then once he died, they didn't all of a sudden became hated by the Egyptians. Oh, Joseph is gone. Let's get those Hebrews. Not in no way has that ever made sense to me. And I know that's how it's preached. And it's preached that way because they cannot connect the dots. Come back to me. They cannot connect the dots. Who these foreign kings were that knew not Joseph. They were not kings in Egypt. They were kings that came into Egypt that knew not Joseph. Now, I don't want to dwell on that. I could preach a whole message on that, but I think I make the point. As proof that he lived during the Hyksos areas, their proof, the traditional's proof, historians cite that the fact that Joseph was getting a chariot when he was made vizier. And of course, I'll just write it here in Iran in case you want to go to it. Genesis, you get back to the map. Genesis 41:43. Well, let's just go to it ourselves. Genesis 41:43. What does Genesis 41:43 read? It reads, well, let's back up to 41. 41:41. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. After Joseph interpreted the dreams, and Pharaoh makes him ruler. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And verse 43 reads, And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. So we have actually two chariots here. That's mentioned in verse 43. Two chariots. Now their reasoning for the traditionalists, that is, that Joseph lived in somewhere around the 17th dynasty, is because there was no chariots in the 3rd and 4th dynasty. Let me continue reading. They assert that the chariot was not introduced into Egypt until the 18th dynasty, because none had been discovered in tombs prior to the New Kingdom era. Once again, their timelines are off. Remember that. Joseph is not in the 17th dynasty or the 18th dynasty or early the 16th dynasty. He was in the 3rd to the 4th dynasty. That's when he was living and ruling. Of course, just because no chariots have been found is not proof that they did not exist. Negative evidence is the weakest evidence for a premise. Nevertheless, the question of the chariot introduces a new puzzle. Excavations in Kish, on the east edge of Babylon, uncovered a 4-wheeled chariot. Let's go there, a map. Here's Egypt. But they also discovered, it would be in this general area right there, a 4-wheeled chariot. Leave it on there for a minute. The age of this artifact is credited to predate Egypt's first dynasty. Egypt's first dynasty. Remember, Noah had sons. Their son had sons. That's where we get Cush. Eventually, Nimrod, and so forth. They migrated to this area, but other sons also migrated Mizraim to Egypt, and so forth. In a sense, shortly after the flood, the first few years, this is one big cartel, if you want to call it a family. Dynasties that had common denominators. And what are those common denominators? The same knowledge. Probably share the same information. Cush being the ringleader originally, the father of chaos, influenced not just this general area, but also this general area. Probably prior or during the first dynasty in Egypt. Now, some of this ain't going to make sense to you if you didn't listen to all the previous teaching, especially all the scribblings that you see on the screen there. But that's why I encourage you to go back and listen to it. So they, during excavations in Kish on the east edge of Babylon, uncovered a 4-winged chariot. The ageless artifact is credited to predate Egypt's first dynasty. Knowing that Egypt had intimate contact with the Babylonian culture as early as the first dynasty, plus not only intimate contact, they shared the same religions. The byproducts of the moon god worship and the sun worship. Knowing that Egypt had intimate contact with the Babylonian culture as early as the first dynasty, plus the presence of Babylonian Semitic names of the kings in Egypt's second dynasty, we must assume that Egyptians had exposure to chariots long before the Hyksos era. So basically, that kind of wipes out, to make a long story short, that kind of wipes out, well, There was no chariots in the the third or fourth dynasty. Chariots only existed in the 18th dynasty. Yeah, if your timelines are all messed up, I guess you could hold on to that traditional point of view. But let me tell you, my friend, I have proven to you that dynasties, the age of Egypt has changed. Just in the last 30 years, from anywhere from 5500 BC, depending who you follow, all the way down to 3000 BC, and some people say even less than that, maybe 2700 BC. It's almost insane to keep hanging on to traditional views. But anyway, let's continue. The Hyksos people were also known as shepherd kings because they had the custom of driving cattle in front of their armies to break up enemy defenses. And by the way, that custom would stay around in ancient times for centuries after centuries after centuries. I just preached a message about three kings coming together, and they were concerned because they didn't have no water for their own thirst, for their cattle's thirst, and their beasts. Why do you think those beasts and cattle were there, traveling along with them when they were going to go into war? Because they're going to use them in war. It was very customary to use your beasts, no matter what they were, to be used in war if they could break the army's front line or put your opponent's army in disarray. So anyway, continuing. The Hyksos people were also known as the shepherd kings because they had the custom of driving cattle in front of their armies to break up any enemy defenses. They came to Egypt shortly after the 12th dynasty, 12th dynasty, and occupied Egypt through the second intermediate period until the 17th dynasty. Now we're getting closer to Moses' day. Currently, historians reason that because the Hyksos shepherd kings had more in common with the nomadic Hebrews, they would be more likely to accept a Hebrew such as Joseph as the vizier of the land. Well, the problem with that, friends, is it was just not the Hebrews that were nomadic on this map. Go back to the map. Hebrews basically, let me get another color if I can. Let's go black. Hebrews basically lived in that general area. Yes, that's the general area approximately. The problem is nomadic people outside of being Hebrews also existed in this area where the Hyksos came from, even on this area up here, definitely in this area, outside the major cities of Babylon and and so forth. All this was nomadic. Even up in this area, they have found that to be nomadic. So, just because the Hebrews were nomadic doesn't mean there were not other nomadic people that were not Hebrews existing in the Middle East of that day. So that kind of breaks down. The placement of Joseph in Egypt during the Hyksos period is typical of reasoning performed by today's chronologists, as exampled by the following quote: "The idea that Joseph, a Hebrew slave, could have become the Pharaoh's highest governing official is not as fanciful as it might sound. About the time of his arrival between 720 and 1700 BC, Egypt was invaded by a Syro-Canaanite alliance called the Hyksos by the Egyptians. These invaders established their own line of pharaohs and ruled the country for about 150 years. For about 150 years. Hated foreigners themselves, it was likely that Hyksos might trust someone like Joseph sooner than they would a native Egyptian. And the account of Joseph's rise to power had an undeniably authentic flavor. Another part of the narrative in which the Pharaoh acquired most of the country's land during a famine would be easy to understand if Egypt had been under the Hyksos. Traditional point of view. This is an attempt to synchronize, now I was quoting there from the great people of the Bible. I'll even give you the source there, which is nonsense. This attempt to synchronize Hebrew and Egyptian histories is a direct contradiction to what the Bible says. Genesis reports that after Joseph's father arrived in Egypt with herds of cattle, Joseph advised his brothers that Egyptians considered shepherds to be an abomination. Well, let's just read it for ourselves. Go back to Genesis 46. Genesis 46. Let's look at, let's see here. Starting with verse 30. And Israel said unto Joseph, now let me die. Since, well, is it 40? That ain't it. That's not what I want. 46. Yeah, here he goes. Verse 30. And Israel said unto Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen thy face, because thou art yet alive. Joseph and his father are reunited for the first time after many, many years. And Joseph said unto his brethren, and unto his father's house, I will go up and show Pharaoh, and say unto him, my brethren and my father's house, which were in the land of Canaan, are come up to me. And the men are shepherds. For their trade had been to feed cattle, and they have brought their flocks and their herds, and all they have. And it shall come to pass, when Pharaoh, listen closely, shall call you, and shall say, what is your occupation? That ye shall say, this is what you're going to say. Thy servants' trade have been about cattle from our youth, even until now, both we and also our fathers, that ye may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. In other words, what Joseph is telling his father is, you're going to tell him this is your occupation. Egypt didn't like foreigners. Egypt even liked less is foreigners that were shepherds. To them it was an abomination. They were clean-cut, shaven, always bathing, not a smelly shepherd. They didn't want no part of them. Look at Joseph's wisdom here, friends. Led by God, you're going to tell Pharaoh that you're a shepherd, which is telling the truth. They were their own shepherd kings, not Hyksos shepherd kings, but their own shepherd kings. That was their occupation. And guess what? Pharaoh's going to take that information. He's going to accept you into his country, into his nation, but he's going to keep you separated. Because he didn't want friction with his Egyptian population that would rebel against that if you intermingle. So keep him separate. You see how God was working through Joseph already? Remember, the Hebrews were never to commingle with the Canaanites or Enites. And here in Egypt, Joseph had the foresight, before they even went back to the land of Canaan, where God says, don't mix it with those Ite people because of their false religion and false gods. And I don't believe the Egyptians at that time, when Joseph was in rule and had power over the nation, were worshiping false gods, to tell you the truth. But still, there'll be no commingling going on. There will be a separation, a clear separation. Hebrews are going to be up here in this general area, which I already showed you on the map, Goshen. Right here in the Nile Delta. So basically, the Nile Delta is up here. All this area right there were going to be for the Hebrews to dwell in. All the rest of Egypt were for Egyptians. This statement shows that the family wanted to be segregated from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians felt the same. No, the statement does not show the family wanted to be separated from the Egyptians. It showed that Joseph had the hindsight way before it became policy, if you want to call it that. Law that God laid down not to commingle when we went back to the land of Canaan, to take it as their own possession once again. Now, all we have to prove is that the royal house considered the Hebrews an abomination, and this should establish that the leaders of Egypt during Joseph's era were native Egyptians and not Hyksos kings. Genesis makes this point clear earlier, while Joseph's brothers still thought Joseph was an Egyptian. Of course, you go to Genesis 43. Since we're in Genesis, might as well just take a look at it. Yeah, verse 32. And they sat on, this is Joseph's brothers were trying to obtain some food because of the famine. And they went to Egypt. And they sat on him for him by himself, and they sat on for him by himself, and for them by themselves. So Joseph was separated because Joseph's brothers thought he was an Egyptian, and Joseph didn't lead on yet that he was his brothers. He was their brothers. And for the Egyptians, and they sat on him for himself, and for them by themselves, and for the Egyptians which did eat with him by themselves, because the Egyptians might not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination unto the Egyptians. This plainly shows during Joseph's time the ruling class in Egypt was not the Hebrew-loving shepherd kings, but rather native ruling kings who avoided shepherd cultures. It is extremely clear that Joseph was not vizier to Hyksos kings. This point can be confirmed in other ways. The name given to Joseph when he was made vizier was not a Hyksos name, but a native Egyptian name. The same is true of the name of the wife given to Joseph. Genesis 41:45 says, Pharaoh called Joseph's name Saphnathaniah, which in the Coptic means the man to whom secrets are revealed. Because this name sounds unlike any era of names in Egyptian kings list, is presumed to be a title name. The elements of this title contain Path and Nith, P-T-A-H and N-E-I-T-H, with a Hebrew spelling. These title elements do not belong to the Hyksos or a New Kingdom era, but were prominent during the Old Kingdom. Because modern historians selected the wrong era for Joseph, they have been absolutely unable to come up with any hard evidence to show that Hebrews were in Egypt during the Hyksos era or later during the New Kingdom. Now, I believe they were, because I believe there eventually were foreign kings that do not Joseph and came in and made the Hebrew slaves. It is the lack of evidence which has caused several traditionists to deny the Hebrews ever were in Egypt. However, by correctly placing Joseph in Egypt's proper era, somewhere between the 3rd and 4th dynasty, our evidence of his life and times continues to accumulate. Now, the only thing I want you to get out of this tonight, and like I said, this is by no means even close to a complete history of the Hyksos. Who they were, where they came from, what they were about, their culture, their characteristics, none of that stuff. Their social habits, none of that stuff. I'm not interested in Hyksos except you understanding that these were those foreign kings that came in that knew not Joseph, which to the Hebrews would eventually cause a lot of turmoil, suffering, slavery, and bondage. But then Moses comes on the scene. And we're not near Moses yet. I probably have another 3, 4, 5 messages before I get there. I just wanted to point out tonight, it's nonsense. It's not putting the pieces of the puzzle correctly together to try to connect the Hyksos to the Joseph, Imhotep, Pathopet time period. And I'm probably the only one that will actually even say this, that it never made sense, no matter who I listened to, no matter what I read, why the kings of Egypt that honored Joseph, Imhotep, Pathopet, whatever you want to call them, not only during his lifetime, but for centuries and centuries afterwards, still honoring him, why they would turn on him and his people. Unless something so drastically happened that we don't know about yet took place. I'm telling you, and this is what I want you to get out of this tonight. It was those Hyksos. And guess where they're coming from? The same era today that is nothing but a problem for the nation of Israel that's in the Middle East. Some things never change, my friend. History does keep repeating itself. But history will come to a completion someday because it won't repeat any longer, because God will say enough's enough, and he'll pull the strings when he wants things to happen that are still prophetically going to happen, and there are no more going to be turmoil and upheaval, death, or anything else in that area or any other area, because he'll come to rule and reign and set things anew, put him in its right order. With the King of Kings sitting on his throne, Satan cast out into a lake of fire with a false prophet, the beast, and all who would not bow down and worship the one true God. So that's what I want you to get out of this tonight. I'm tempted to go further, but I think I'll let that just sit for a while until next time. If you got something out of it tonight, and hopefully you did, I want to hear from you. Play a song.